What would you do if the person you loved most kept smiling through exhaustion, pretending everything was under control, while you quietly burned your own hands in a sweltering kitchen just to give him one small reason to believe tomorrow would be kinder? It began as one of those mornings when the heat feels personal, as if the sky itself has decided to press all its weight down upon a small house and test the hearts inside it. Tu Tien woke before the day had fully opened, her skin already damp, her thoughts already circling money, food, weather, and the heavy date no one in that household could truly ignore. It was the 15th, the day Jack had to redeem the bank mortgage. He kept saying it would be fine, that she should not worry, that a man must shoulder his own burdens. But she knew better than to trust those calm words. She had seen the strain in his eyes, the sleeplessness hidden beneath his smile, the quiet way he sat when he thought nobody was looking. So while the world outside promised a week of blistering sun and no mercy, she made a simple, stubborn decision. If she could not remove the weight from his shoulders, she would at least feed his strength, comfort his body, and help the next day bring a little money into the house. She would make bon duc for the market. She would cook a stew with pig heart, kidney, and mugwort for his health. She would turn heat, labor, and worry into nourishment. Yet, while she stood over the stove thinking only of care, another story was unfolding under the same sun: a piece of land, a handshake, a promise of peace for Uncle Dũng, and then a hidden deception waiting to crack open. By nightfall, their kitchen would be a wreck, Jack's body bruised, and their fragile sense of safety shattered. And still, even after the violence, love would remain stubborn enough to sit down among broken bowls, slice warm cake, and rise at dawn to sell hope for 10,000 dong a bag. The morning began with heat and worry. Tu Tien opened her eyes and lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling while sweat gathered at her temples. The air inside the room felt thick and trapped, like a damp cloth thrown over her face. Even the bedsheet clung to her skin. She sighed softly, almost like a complaint whispered to herself, then reached for her phone. The weather forecast showed sun after sun after sun, an entire week of harsh light, no rain, no relief. Her face tightened. Heat like this changed everything. It changed the mood of the market, the condition of vegetables, the pace of labor, even the appetite of people who bought food. She wondered what she should harvest, what would sell well, what could endure this weather. Then she remembered the old recipe book, Bon Duc. The thought came to her slowly, then settled with surprising certainty. It was simple, familiar, filling, and affordable. If she made it well, people at the nearby market would buy it. That little idea bloomed into purpose. Still lying down, she flipped through the yellowed pages, reading carefully, tracing the lines with her finger, whispering the steps to herself so she would not forget. But even in that moment of planning, Jack entered her thoughts. Today was the 15th. She knew what that meant. No matter how lightly he tried to talk about it, the mortgage had to be redeemed. The bank had to be dealt with. His mind, already worn thin by work and responsibility, was carrying that weight alone. Tu Tien closed the book and sat up quickly. Her concern for him overruled her own fatigue at once. She rose, rinsed the rice, and measured 5, then 6 bowls into water. If she was going to do this, she would do it properly. While the rice soaked, she spoke briefly to the house-sitter, asking them to watch the house, then grabbed her money and hurried toward the market beneath a sun that already felt too strong for the early hour. The market was alive, but the heat was merciless. Voices rose and fell from the stalls. Metal bowls clinked. Vendors called out their wares. The smell of herbs, fish, raw meat, and wet vegetables mixed beneath the heavy air. Sweat glistened on Tu Tien's face, but she did not slow down. At the meat stall, she asked for pig heart and kidney. The seller named the price 105,000 dong, and as she paid, she asked how best to stew them so they would be nourishing. The woman suggested mugwort. Tu Tien nodded at once. The idea felt right. Jack had been sleeping badly. He often carried headaches quietly. Something medicinal, something warm, something made with care. This was exactly what she wanted. She moved on to buy raw peanuts, choosing half a kilogram carefully. Then, a packet of stew seasoning. On the way home, she stopped near the garden and picked fresh mugwort, recalling what Jack himself had once said, that the herb was good for sleep, good for headaches, good for a body carrying too much strain. That memory pierced her more deeply than she expected. Why didn't he share more with her? Why did he always protect everyone from his burdens, even when the protection cost him so much? She did not speak the thought aloud. She simply carried the ingredients home, her heart full of tenderness and a quiet sadness she could do nothing with, except turn it into food. Back in the kitchen, the work began in earnest. She soaked the peanuts. She ground the rice. She lifted the heavy stone mortar and felt the weight drag through her arms and back. The room was stifling now, almost cruel in its heat. Sweat ran down her cheeks and neck, dripped from her chin, soaked her blouse. Still, she kept moving, as if each task were its own prayer. In one pot, the heart and kidneys simmered with seasoning and mugwort, sending up a smell that was both earthy and medicinal. In another, the rice batter thickened slowly. Tu Tien stirred and stirred, determined not to let it scorch. She whispered encouragement to herself, half embarrassed, half sincere. "It's so heavy today. It has to turn out well. It must be delicious." This was her first time making bon duc in such quantity. She divided the batter into 3 batches, working carefully. The whole kitchen seemed to be made of heat and effort, steam, fire, sweat, aching arms, the dull throb in her back from bending too long. But every time she thought about stopping for a breath, she pictured Jack's face when he returned home tired, hungry, trying not to show how much the day had worn him down. That image carried her forward. This was how she loved him, not with grand speeches, but with soaked rice, careful seasoning, and hands that kept working long after the body wanted rest. By the time the final batch of batter had cooked into soft, golden bon duc, she covered the pots tightly against dust and let herself smile. Tomorrow, if all went well, these would sell. Elsewhere, the same sun had turned the road to a red river of dust. Jack was out with Uncle Dũng, heading toward the land the older man had been considering. The property stretched over more than 2 hectares, with an old house already standing, though in need of repairs. The surrounding trees were green and generous, the soil fertile, the atmosphere quiet enough to suggest another kind of life. Uncle Dũng walked the land with growing satisfaction. Jack explained everything patiently, his tone warm and steady. The place was near his own farm. It would suit farming, livestock, and peace. After years of noise, work, and movement, a man like Uncle Dũng deserved somewhere he could finally breathe. Negotiation followed. The price came down from 200 million to 180. Uncle Trung, the landowner, was called to meet them in person. Money was counted. The transfer was discussed. Keys changed hands. For a few shining moments, the whole atmosphere seemed transformed by relief. Uncle Dung's eyes carried the rare, almost childlike brightness of someone who feels a new chapter opening. Jack, watching him, felt lighter too. This was not just a purchase. It felt like hope made visible. The harsh sun overhead mattered less when both men stood imagining a quieter future rooted in green land and simple work. Back in the kitchen, Tu Tien was still cooking when Jack finally returned. He stepped into a room rich with the smell of bon duc and stew. The warmth of the place wrapped around him before her voice did. She turned with a bright smile and told him at once what she had made, that the bon duc was for tomorrow's market, and that the stew was for him. His tired face changed immediately. There was surprise first, then gratitude, then something more tender and helpless than either of those. He sat down. She served him the hot stew and sliced the warm cake. He praised her skill, his voice soft with genuine admiration. Tu Tien, trying to keep the moment light, reminded him that mugwort would help him sleep and that she knew he had been under pressure. The food soothed him, so did her nearness. As they ate, he told her about Uncle Dung's land purchase, the 2 hectares, the old house, the lowered price. He promised to take her there soon. She listened with delight, glad for the rare spark of good news in his day. For a little while, the weather, the mortgage, the worry about tomorrow, all of it receded. Then, without warning, the storm arrived. Uncle Dung had gone back to inspect the property more closely and discovered the truth. The house was no real house at all, only a decaying ruin far worse than what had been presented. Rage took hold of him instantly. Feeling cheated, humiliated, and robbed of 180 million dung, he gathered several men and went straight to confront Jack. The house filled with noise before Tu Tien fully understood what was happening. Shouting erupted. Feet pounded against the floor. Jack barely had time to rise before the first blows landed. Men lunged at him. Their fists were fueled by fury, disappointment, and the reckless stupidity of collective anger. Tu Tien froze in the corner. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she watched Jack take the beating. And while they attacked him, they also attacked everything around them. Bowls shattered, chairs overturned. The table was shoved aside. One of the pots tipped and spilled her carefully prepared stew across the floor. Another strike knocked down the ban duc setup. Batter splashed. Plates cracked. The small, warm kitchen she had spent all day filling with care became a scene of chaos and ruin. It was not only objects that broke. Trust broke. Peace broke. The simple domestic rhythm she had been trying so hard to protect broke. When the men finally left, Jack was bruised and unsteady. The house was wrecked. The food was partly ruined. Tu Tien's body still trembled with shock. But even then, she did not collapse. Instead, she turned back to the kitchen. Among the broken things, she rescued what she could. She finished the remaining ban duc. She reheated the stew that had not spilled. Then she sat down with Jack in the middle of the wreckage and served him anyway. He ate in silence at first. Then, painfully, gratefully, he praised her cooking again. Even with sore hands, he reached to help cover the pots and cut the cakes. The two of them sat among broken bowls and overturned furniture, eating like survivors who had found a brief shelter inside each other. That meal tasted like sorrow and devotion. Tu Tien looked at him and felt regret, fear, and love twisting together so tightly she could hardly tell them apart. Yet, the fact remained. Though everything around them had been damaged, they were still sitting side by side. The next morning, they went to market together. The air was cooler then, but only just. Tu Tien arranged the 3 batches of ban duc into neat 10,000 dung portions. At first, buyers were slow to come. She called out cheerfully anyway, telling women passing by that the cakes were homemade, fragrant, and delicious. Jack stood beside her, fetched a chair, helped with small tasks, and stayed close enough that her courage did not falter. Then the sales began. 1 bag, 2, more. Customers asked about the peanuts. She admitted with shy honesty that it was her first time making them. Someone laughed and asked when ban duc would finally have bones, and she laughed too, the market briefly turning playful around her. By midday, every last bag had sold. Tu Tien let out a breath she had been holding since before dawn. Jack packed things up, returned the borrowed chair, and smiled at her with a pride that made the whole exhausting day before feel worthwhile. They walked home together beneath the sun, hand in hand, tired but lighter. The weather was still harsh. The mortgage still existed. The house still held signs of violence. But something had survived all of it. They had. And perhaps that was the truest thing love gave them that day. Not safety, not ease, but the stubborn grace to cook through fear, eat through ruin, sell through exhaustion, and keep walking home together as if hope no matter how bruised, still belong to both of them.